New Zealand discussion series. Nice to see you. It's being videoed tonight and it will be up on Every Child Counts NZ YouTube channel, so you can take a look at it and let anyone who didn't manage to get along have a look also. It seems clear from our dismal statistics that New Zealand can't care for its children. Simple as that. But it's not for lack of genuine desire on the part of a majority of the population. Here's philanthropist Owen Glenn in his new book. I've just read it, so it's kind of top of mind at the moment. New Zealand's record in child abuse is a national disgrace. We have the 5th highest rate in the OECD. A child dies of abuse here every 5 weeks. A child under 2 is admitted to hospital with preventable injuries every 5 days. We have the 2nd highest rate of teenage pregnancies in the world, and our suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds is the highest in the OECD, double that of Australia. Owen Glenn says we must do something. We can't leave it up to the government. So his Glenn Family Foundation is launching a pilot project called Help, Make a Difference, focusing on breaking intergenerational cycles of family violence, child abuse and neglect. Starting in Aotearoa and building community through sport and music, responsibility within that community and education. You could argue that already there are heaps of programs. There's government programs, there's non-government programs, there's other sorts of programs. Are they coordinated? Do we have continuity? That may be one of the issues we'll discuss tonight. I applaud Owen Glenn's efforts. Who wouldn't? But tonight we're asking the question, what can the business community do to ensure that New Zealand children are able to participate in the economy in the broader sense of that phrase? We have 4 speakers, as you can see tonight. Let me introduce them all briefly. Of course, Phil O'Reilly, Chief Executive of Business New Zealand. Jenny Prince is Chief Executive of Plunket New Zealand. Pam Moose is formerly of KPMG. She's done extensive work in health and human services. She's been a maternal child health nurse. She's been both at the cutting edge and at the administrative room. And Pastor Chris Solar, who, as you can tell, because he hasn't taken his coat off, is also from Auckland. He's from the Dream Centre in Manukau. You will hear all in due course, but first, let me invite Phil O'Reilly from Business New Zealand to speak.
Good evening. Thanks, Kim, for the introduction. And can I particularly acknowledge Les Gibbs and Deborah Morris-Travers, who originally came to see me at Business New Zealand to talk to me about how the business community and Business New Zealand more specifically might assist in the Every Child Counts campaign. And this series of conversations, debates, call it what you will, was one of the first ideas that came out of the hat. We hopefully will have others, and hopefully we'll continue the conversation. And of course, as many of you will know, I'm also on the expert advisory panel for the Children's Commissioner on ideas about solving or alleviating child poverty in New Zealand. So spending a lot of my time around the children issue at the moment. So you might ask a question, why should business be involved? What's the, business isn't generally involved in these things. Surely this should be the concern of NGOs or of governments. Well, the short point is, if you think about this, businesses aren't an end in themselves. They're a means to an end, actually. We've all, sometimes it's a mistake that business people make to think that they are the end. They're not. They're the means to an end. The end, actually, is successful communities, successful societies, successful countries. Now, I'll argue that, of course I would argue this, but I will argue that successful businesses are a mission-critical part of that end. But the short point is businesses need successful communities in which to operate, and successful businesses will lead to successful communities. So businesses have an obvious interest in the success of communities, and they demonstrate that through their activities every day. Second point, the reason we're engaged is that kids with a less successful childhood, young people with a less successful childhood, will tend to be less successful adults. And those are the same people that we're going to be trying to employ in our factories and offices and in our businesses as they get older. So they'll either end up as a burden on the state, or they'll end up potentially as less successful adults and therefore less successful employees. So there's an obvious I think, a reasonably bright red line to trying to make sure that businesses are engaged in successful childhood. Third point, many of the children we're talking about, certainly some of the children we're talking about will also be the children of the employees of businesses. So their parents will be working inside the businesses that are members of Business New Zealand. And of course, if those parents have concerns about those children, or if their families are less successful, those employees are also likely to be less successful in business, and we want them to be successful. Fourth point, more successful children means, I think, a wealthier society. And from a business perspective, I kind of like wealthy societies because it's easier to sell stuff to rich people. So I'm kind of interested in successful societies for that reason. And the fifth point is that there is an emerging, fully emerged actually, sometimes we just ignore it in New Zealand, a fully emerged business conversation about sustainability. And in the New Zealand context, often we talk about sustainability purely in an environmental context. It's a good thing to talk about in that sense. I was just doing a further speech on that this morning to a group. So environmental sustainability tends to be at the top of our thinking. But if we think about businesses around the world, and if we think about New Zealand businesses too, sustainability also includes social sustainability, community sustainability, human sustainability. So because business isn't operating in a vacuum, it's important that we also talk about the sustainability of the societies in which business operates. So there are some other reasons you could come up with, no doubt, but those are at least five that I can think of about why businesses would be involved in this kind of activity. Second point, let me kind of make a point that you will already know if you work inside, for example, children-centred NGOs or community groups of one sort or another. The businesses are already doing a whole lot of activity in this area, and I list a few. Fonterra with free milk in schools, Sanitarium also doing breakfast for underprivileged kids, Pumpkin Patch, Cure Kids, TVNZ sponsoring stuff, Microsoft donates software to organisations like Barnardo's and many others besides. Lion Nathan has a foundation on this, ASB, Westpac, ANZ does Plunkett, HSBC, Books and Homes, the BNZ also with Plunkett, Foodstuffs has Canteen, and so the list goes on. In other words, corporate New Zealand has for some time now been engaged in this kind of activity, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully, and businesses are continually learning about some of this. But what I think the debate needs to move on to is not only how do we support other activities in this space, but how do we also make sure that businesses themselves play a part in both solving or helping solve some of the problems that we've got, but also acting in a family-friendly fashion more often in their own business activities, and I'll come to that in a second. What's the interesting thing about that statistic, or the interesting thing about that list, is you might think that, well, all the big guys have been taken. Everybody's got a sponsorship arrangement or some sort of thing that they're doing. Well, as a matter of fact, a recent survey from the Charities Commission that we're going to do some work with them on over the next few months showed that a large number of companies, 30% of this particular survey, wanted to get involved in making a difference through charity giving. Not all for kids, of course, but not a bad start, but they haven't actually yet. So they were, a third of the companies in the survey that the Charities Commission carried out were interested in further conversations with community groups and others about how they might make a difference in their communities. As I say, not all for kids, but not a bad start. So there are continuing opportunities, and one of the things I'm noticing is that businesses more generally, not just big businesses, but also medium and small businesses, are increasingly thinking about these kinds of issues because they increasingly understand that it's not just about a nice to do thing. It's not just about a corporate responsibility or however that might be defined inside a company. It's not just in that box. It's actually increasingly a part of how you might go about doing business in New Zealand. So that's an exciting thing, and we should all be encouraging that activity. I certainly am trying to do that. Some of the solutions that we see, or some of the kind of big principal solutions that we see when we think about this from a top line perspective at business, three or four that I can think of. First, choices matter. Parents who have choices will often make those choices to benefit their children. Often the children who won't be in trouble or who are at risk have as parents people who are not capable of making those choices because of the fact they don't have a job, or they don't have skills, or of their particular location, or their particular lifestyle, or their life choice, or the way they are in life. So business can play a role in providing both jobs and skills, and businesses do that, of course, every time they go about doing their business. But that certainly means that we should be doing everything we can to make sure that we get as many people into work, that there are no barriers to that, that businesses are encouraged to do that, and that they see little risk in doing that. So anything we can do around that's going to be helpful. Second, cohesion is important. Cohesion is another word I'd use as part of a principal piece of thinking about solutions to at-risk kids. And what we know is that kids will tend to do better in a cohesive society. And successful business, the fact that businesses are offering wages and offering jobs in societies is a clear part of building that cohesion. And the third point is entrepreneurship. If it's not necessarily about being employed, many of those who might be in a situation with at-risk kids may be long-term unemployed or may have difficulties with working particular hours or in particular locations. So one of the solutions there, one of the options there is to create entrepreneurship, create businesses, create jobs from nothing that they might be interested in doing. Because I think one of the saddest things we can do as a society is simply say to people, for example, DPB mums, listen, your job's just to sit on the sidelines, just take some money, we never want to see you again, go away. That's a terrible thing. We want to try and encourage those people to engage in society if we can, obviously. The short point I'm going to make to you is that there's no silver bullet solution. The problem of at-risk kids, at-risk children, is a classic example of a complex, wicked problem. Government cannot fix it alone, and those who think it might, or those who consistently try to call government to account and say it's this minister's fault or it's that bureaucrat's fault, whichever ideological persuasion you might be in, I'm just very confident that's actually not going to solve the problem. Government has a clear role, there's no question about that, but other actors in society also have a role, and that includes business. Let me tell you about 3 examples of how we've tried to, as a personal experience of trying to do that in my working life. I used to work for an Australian bank, I apologise. It was Westpac Banking Corporation. I was working for them in Sydney, I apologise again. I came back to New Zealand, but so I was working for a large bank in Sydney, and my job was working inside the corporate human resources function. And among other things, I was in charge of a thing called employment policy, in other words, how we go about what are the rules around employment inside the bank. And another thing I was in charge of was diversity. That was interesting. It was a very interesting role. And my boss at that stage was a person who some of you may know, Anne Sherry, who's now the CEO of Carnival Cruises, but at that time was the head of corporate HR for Westpac. And Westpac was a leader, and still is, in childcare, on-site, subsidised, company-delivered childcare. And I was in charge of that piece at Westpac for a number of years. And one of the things I learnt was that it's incredibly difficult to get company-based childcare going inside corporations, even when you've got the kind of commitment of Anne Sherry behind you, a real, an absolute gem of a person in thinking about this stuff, because any large corporate will think immediately about the corporate reputational risks of providing childcare. You know, what happens if a kid gets sick? What happens if someone dies? What happens if an inappropriate person gets hired? What happens if there's a fire? And so all of those corporate reputational risks associated with large companies providing childcare directly just overwhelm often the debate that goes on inside companies about doing this kind of thing. And I remember talking to Anne about that at 60 Martin Place in Sydney and saying, you know, those are the risks of doing some more of this stuff. We already had a couple we were looking to expand, and her view was we're just doing it anyway. The risks, interesting, I hear those risks, I understand those risks, we're just doing it anyway. So we're going to get on with providing childcare for our staff. So that kind of commitment is necessary to overcome some of those barriers. And what we learned was a whole bunch of lessons about how to do childcare well for a company. We had to site it where it was convenient for users, not actually at corporate headquarters, but on the main routes in and out of cities so that both mums and dads could play a part in childcare or picking kids up or whatever it might be. We found even with a company our size, a huge company, 22,000 staff in Australia, we split to go and try and partner with other large companies, the likes of Coles, Woolies, large companies that also had large staff footprints where we would have. And one of the things we found was when we put these childcare centres in place in good faith, we often got middle class capture of them. We often got senior staff capture of them. So for example, we put a childcare centre in downtown Sydney, and we found that largely our more senior corporate staff were getting access to it because people in branches in Rooty Hill or in Parramatta were miles away from it. So we had to really think hard about how we could actually be inclusive, even if we were trying to do a good thing. was quite hard to think about how you could be as inclusive as possible given the kind of spread that we had amongst our people at Westpac, even in a big town like Sydney, 4 million people. And the challenge Anne gave me around that was to say, she said to me once, I want a childcare centre in Bathurst. For those of you who know Australia, that's like saying, that would be in a New Zealand context, that would be her saying, I want a childcare centre in Ashburton. It's a massive challenge. How do we do that? How would we build scale in a place like Bathurst in order to make that work from a business perspective? So what we actually did at the end of the day, we outsourced it to ABC Childcare, as it turns out, and they fell over and we had to take it back over again after I left. So what I'm saying to you is there's a difficulty of companies doing this. I'm not trying to make an excuse for them, but this is a company that actually went and did it. That was my experience, and I did it on their behalf. Even when you've got that kind of commitment, it's really quite hard to make sure that you make that work for everybody inside the corporation. So one of the lessons from me out of that was we need a lot more conversations amongst even businesses that are willing to do this kind of thing about some of the lessons they learn, about some of the pitfalls they face, even with the best will in the world. The second example I'll give you is parental leave. Westpac, like most other large Australian corporates here and in Australia, obviously there's a minimum government provision of paid parental leave in Australia, and Westpac, like a lot of other corporates, added some more to that. I can't remember what it was 6 months or whatever it was, 12 months or something by the time I left. So we considered it a corporate good to actually add to the government's minimum provision of paid parental leave. One of the things we found, that was all in good faith of course, one of the things we found when we did that was the longer employees were away from work, the harder it was to get them back. No matter how well-meaning you were, no matter how well-meaning they were, they lost connection to the workplace. So that was despite incredible efforts that we made to send them magazines and ring them up, the team leader would ring them up, we'd get them back in to do the birthday thing and all that sort of stuff, get the nipper back into work and get mum to, dad or whatever to show them, do all that sort of stuff. And still we were struggling if they'd been away for a while to get them back to work for the reason that they got disconnected from the workforce and their skills really rapidly deteriorated because of the fast pace of the business that we were in, their skills would deteriorate. And then when we brought them back, often we'd think, it must be easy to bring them back, we'll do a part-time job or we'll do job share. Actually, it was quite hard to construct those kinds of jobs, particularly when the team had already reformed and moved on. So the lesson for that from me, from my perspective, the thing I learnt was, if we are talking about parental leave, then parental leave is about giving people paid leave from the workforce to enable them to spend quality time with their very young, and then they come back to work. That's the successful outcome of the policy if you get that right. It's not about parental go off forever. It's parental leave, right? Come back to work. So we need to have a conversation about what the balance looks like. What's the length of parental leave that we should have in New Zealand in order to encourage mums and dads to stay at home with their very young, and what's the time that we should be encouraging them to get back to work so that they don't lose connection from the workforce and stay out of work for a very, very long time, because that's got a whole bunch of bad outcomes for kids as well. So it's a very, very complex issue. So I don't think we're in New Zealand we should say, gosh, the answer is the longer the parental leave, the better, because that has potentially a downside impact later on. That was my learning. And the last one I'll give you in talking about this is the example of sick pay. Once again, at Westpac, we offered generous sick pay provisions, 10 days a year or something like that was what we were doing. And what we found was that this was being abused. People would take sickies, time off without notice. And we'd ask for a medical certificate and they couldn't give us one and all that sort of stuff. Turns out that what was actually happening was a lot of those staff members were taking sickies in order to take little Johnny to the optometrist or the dentist, or because the little Johnny was feeling sick that day or whatever it might have been. So in other words, people were using sick leave in order to look after sick kids or in order to look after their kids' social or health needs. And when I looked around at the corporation, I was in charge of industrial relations at that time, in charge of that policy. When I looked around, it was easy for people sitting in the corporate centre, people sitting all around me in Martin Place at Sydney, to take little Johnny to the dentist. They'd just leave their desk. They wouldn't apply for sick leave. They'd just say, Phil, I'm off. I'm taking Johnny to the dentist today. In other words, looking after their children's health. And I was okay with that. Why wouldn't you be? It's fine. But staff out in our branch, sitting out there trying to serve customers, or people do it in our processing centres, processing checks or telephone calls, whatever it might have been, were struggling to do exactly that, which seemed rather unfair to me. So what we set up at Westpac was a sick leave provision that enabled anybody in the bank to not take, because it was a minimum of a day, you had to take a minimum of a day's sick leave. We said it was now a minimum of 2 hours. and we said any staff member can take sick leave, not just for their own illness, but also for the health and well-being of members of their family. It might be their mum or dad who's sick, or it might be their nipper or whoever it might be. But you had to give notice to the boss, and you had to get permission, which was fine. And most of the team leaders, of course, were very happy to do that. Some of the team leaders and some of the managers were unhappy about that. They said, gee, sick leave is going to rocket as a result of that. These people are going to take a lot of time off. It turns out that sick leave provision inside Westpac Banking Corporation fell as a result of that. In other words, less people took sickies. So actually we had less sick leave going on inside the corporation following that change than before we had. And the reason was people started trusting the system. So instead of trying to rip the system off or take a day off, they'd just take 2 hours off because that's all it would take to get Johnny to the dentist or whatever it might be. And they'd come back to work and they'd feel happier and more contented and more committed and engaged with the workplace as a result. So there's 3 examples of how complex and how much thought needs to go into these kinds of family-friendly provisions inside firms. And at the Expert Advisory Group on Child Poverty, we're talking about child-friendly work practices, child-friendly workplaces. And as one who's had some experience of that, I can assure you it's not quite as simple as just saying that and making it happen. You need to think deeply through what you're trying to do, and even when you act in good faith to try and achieve an outcome, you'll often find unintended consequences that you didn't think about that you need to go back and sort out again. So I think more companies should be thinking about that. I certainly advocate that in New Zealand, and I want to advocate that tonight. But I'd also say it's important that we all support that process sensibly, because companies will stumble and make mistakes, and companies need to be encouraged along that track, because by doing that, they're more likely to get it right, and they're more likely, actually, to get a more understanding and more engaged workforce, and it's likely to be better for kids. So I'll leave it there. Thanks very much for your time, and I look forward to the question session.